Thank you. So what I'm going to do first is actually to start off with a bit of an introduction for you, just to give you an idea of what we're covering this time. And our plans for this time is that I will be talking about pest prevention, in the sense that we'll cover some things that you can do to help discourage pests coming in the first place, but also the sorts of things that we can do to sort of intervene more directly on the objects and the buildings if needs be. And then finally, I'll finish off with a session just thinking about how we implement the whole spectrum, if you like, of IPM, how that works. Now, what I'm intending to do now is to actually put together a little quiz. So I just want to refresh our memory from what we talked about last week. And what I'm going to need to do for making the quiz is to set up a poll. So don't type anything in the chat, don't do anything until the poll appears. So I've just got to get this started up. And then you'll have the option to, in the poll, pick A, B or C and decide what you think the answer is. So I deliberately didn't define IPM when I was just doing my introduction, because I didn't want you to give away the answers, if you like. So if you want to just start thinking about the answer, I am afraid I'm not going to type in the full A, B and C, but this should then hopefully appear. Oh, that's not helpful. Okay, it says that Forms isn't working and it can't reach the app. So in that case, we won't wait for a poll to appear. I'm going to ask you to have a go at typing in the chat whether you think the answer is A, B or C. Okay. Great, thank you all very much, everyone. I see you weren't misled by my 1C when I was trying desperately to think of something else that IPM could stand for. It certainly isn't C. It is actually A, so it's Integrated Pest Management, although within that you are certainly trying to improve your pest monitoring. But the term Integrated Pest Management brings in the monitoring, but it also brings in all sorts of other bits and pieces. And I'll come back to IPM when we get a bit further through. And we'll talk about that a little bit more then. So question 2, I said I've given up on the polls, so just ignore that on the sheet. What is a woolly bear? So if you want to type into the chat whether you think a woolly bear is A, one of my children's teddies, or if it's the larva of a carpet beetle, or if it's the larva of a furniture beetle. So what do you think? Great, well done everyone. You are absolutely spot on. It is indeed the larva of a carpet beetle. And there we go, there is a woolly bear, and there should be a photo credit, so I'll click again. There it is. I didn't take that picture. They're quite hard to find a live woolly bear wandering around. So the next part of the quiz then, what part of a pest life cycle is the most damaging to our objects? Do you think it is the adult, the egg, the larva, or the cocoon? Great, that's fantastic. So we talked about this a bit last week, didn't we? When we were looking at one of the life cycles. I think it was one of the moths that I showed you. But we also talked a little bit more generally about some of the different ways in which pests can do damage. And the egg stage just sits there when it's a cocoon. Again, it's just sitting there. It's not actually eating. It's really the larval stage that does the damage for most pests. There are some pests that go through a life cycle where they go from nymph to adults, like something like silverfish, where you might find that the adult stage will be damaging as well. But overall, it's this larval stage that causes the problems. So well done, you're absolutely right. Okay, we're halfway through our quiz. I've got 6 questions for you. And I took a picture, especially for you guys, of something that we have sitting on one of our shelves at home. So we also thought last week about food and the kinds of things that insects might like to eat. And I thought this was quite an interesting example. So which of these things in the picture do you think that the insects might find tasty? Is it the flowers? Is it the basket? Is it some of the electronics that we've got in the basket? Or is it the surroundings like the wall and ceiling, which are plastered and then painted?
Cool. You done?
Fantastic. Yeah, I can see lots of bees coming up there, and the basket is the thing that they will really, a lot of insects will really enjoy working their way through that. They would eat quite happily eat real flowers, but they won't generally eat the fake flowers because they're not made from something that used to be living. So they can't digest that. These are generally plastic based. They've been quite chemically processed and things like that. So generally they wouldn't choose to eat it as a main food, although insects will sometimes chew through things just because it's there and they want to get to something else. So no, these are a plastic type, so they're fully artificial on these ones. But there are, you know, should you have flowers that are made of a natural fibre, then that's where you might start to get problems, or obviously if you've got real flowers in there as well. Okay, our next one, we also talked about some traps last week. Can you remember what sort of trap this one was? Fantastic, everybody. Well done. Yep, spot on. So this is our blunder trap. It's the one where the pests just wander into it and hopefully get stuck. Okay, last question then. Are bookworms real? We didn't talk about this last week. I just thought I'd put this in for a bit of fun. So it's A, if you think bookworms are actually a real pest, and B, if you think no, it isn't an actual pest species. Interesting. We've got some mixed responses there. So the official answer to this is that no, bookworms aren't a real pest species, as in being an individual species. You will sometimes come across the term bookworm used, though, in terms of any insect that eats books. So it won't be an individual species, but some people might find holes in a book and say, oh, that was caused by a bookworm. But actually, they aren't a real pest species. And we don't tend to use the term professionally because we'd much rather try and figure out exactly which pest it is and try and work out whether it might have come from perhaps most likely some kind of wood boring beetle. So you might find that a woodworm, for example, has eaten through a book because it got in the way of it eating through its way out to the surface, for example. What we tend to find on the main preference for books and paper would be things like book lice and silverfish, but they tend to graze the surface. So you don't really tend to see those kind of holes. A lot of the holes that you might see are more likely to come from sort of other insects that are sort of not using it as a primary food source, but just using it kind of as a route through, if you like. That was a bit of fun. I hope you enjoyed our quiz. So I'll just move on to the next slide, which says well done, and thank you all so much for taking part. It was really nice that you all had a go in the chat and put your questions in there, so you can give yourself all a virtual round of applause. So well done, everyone. What I'm going to do now is other than just checking what my kitten's attacking, is to move on to looking at exactly what we're going to be covering and what I hope that you will get out of this session today in terms of what I'd like you to be able to take away from this. So what I hope that you'll be able to learn from this is that you start to think about ways in which you can make buildings a bit less inviting to pests. But there's no perfect answer to this. It's not always going to work. So you have to be prepared for what you do if you do find pests, what you can do as individuals, and at what point where you might need to bring in an expert for help with this kind of situation if you do have pests around. And then finally, this learning outcome around how we apply IPM. So how we get set up, how we get started with this kind of pest management practices. Now, one of the things to think about, which I'll come back to again as well, is that if we think about insects and the kind of things that they like, we can start to consider how we can make our spaces a bit less of a nice place for insects to live in. As we said last week, insects naturally live outside. They break down dead and decaying matter outside. And if they come in, well, they just carry on with that normal part of their processes through dealing with the life cycle of materials. So what we want them to do is to stay outside, and we don't want them to feel like in homes is a great place for them to live. Now, what they like in order to thrive is they need something to breathe, they need some oxygen, they need something to eat. If there's no food, they'll go somewhere else. It needs to be warm enough. Insects can live in cool conditions, but in terms of having an insect infestation, then it needs to be warm enough for them to breed. That's the only way that you'll end up with an infestation, because if you just have one insect wandering around, nothing really is going to happen to your objects. But if you have many insects and they breed and they create more insects, that's when you start to see problems. And that kind of feeds into the reproduction side of things as well. And the other one that I haven't mentioned yet is about having somewhere to live. The technical term for that is harborage. So they need a home, and they prefer that home to be dark and undisturbed. And quite often their home is also their source of food as well. So they might live and eat in the same environment. Some insects, but not all of them, are more vulnerable to drying out, and so they need levels of relative humidity, so they need it a bit damper in the environment, that are a little bit higher in order to survive. And again, if they don't get that higher levels, then they will either leave and go somewhere else that's a bit damper, or they might just end up dying out entirely. So we can target those because we know what those conditions are, and we can start thinking about how we can use those to make our environments less hospitable for insects. And that's why I'm going to start with this idea of prevention. So how do we try and reduce that the likelihood that insects will want to live in there? Sorry, I just skipped a slide there. So one of those things that we can do is just to take care of the buildings, to keep them clean, and to think about what our food sources are. And I'm going to talk about those aspects in a little bit more detail now. Just in relation to these kind of food sources, just bear in mind that obviously what we can't do anything about for food sources is, say, the building materials or the objects themselves. But there are certainly some aspects that we can bear in mind and that we can start to address. So in terms of building maintenance, I just put a couple of pictures up here as an illustration of the kind of things that might help pests to thrive within an indoor environment. So hopefully you can just about see on the slide over here that we've got an indoor ceiling with some water staining. And if you start having sources of water ingress, obviously it can cause damage to the building fabric. You can get dampness in any wooden elements of the building, which then might make it easier for certain pest species that prefer damp wood to start chewing through it. But also generally, going back to that previous slide about some insects preferring a damper environment, if you have moisture coming in from outside, which can also be a case of things like the block drain that's shown on this slide, you start to get more moisture around within the building, and then that can encourage insects to find that the conditions, those environmental conditions, are suitable for somewhere for them to live. So there are all sorts of other things that you need to think about around that. So things like pest entry points, for example, if you have gaps around windows, if the roof space isn't well maintained, maybe there's a way in which the pigeons can get into it. Things like chimneys, for example, I've already mentioned last week about the risks of birds' nests in chimneys. And while not all of those species are pests in themselves, things like birds, for example, they do make a mess, but they can also provide a food source and bring in other pests with them. So again, they can cause issues. If you have things like, for example, ivy climbing up a building, or large shrubs that back right up onto the brick wall of the building, then it's not necessarily the case that they're a bad thing, but they can give a space for pests to live in. And those pests, because they're living right by the building, would then find it easier to enter. So it can be something that's worth taking a look at. Sometimes vegetation up against a building might also lead to there being a damper area around there, which again, the pests can like that. And more generally around damp, if somewhere is damp, then it can encourage growth of mold, and mold can be a food for some pest species. And as I've mentioned before, these pests, some of these pests that prefer damp conditions, either because they like their food to be damper, or because they feel it suits their sort of harborage preferences. So good building maintenance is something that's really worth keeping an eye on and keeping on top of. Now, in terms of the harborage, as I've already mentioned, pests prefer to be somewhere which is undisturbed, and most of them prefer to be somewhere that's relatively dark. And so if you don't have areas like that, then the pests will move on. They won't want to stay there. So what you can do around this is just to be aware of those areas that might be a potential risk. The sort of things that you might find in properties are things like under sofas or under beds, which maybe don't get moved around very much. They don't get cleaned underneath them very often. It's quite hard work to move things around like that. If you're in somewhere that has a storeroom, and sometimes the corners of the stores or under shelves, again, attics, because people don't really go up and clean attics very often, just at least make sure you keep an eye on those spaces. And chimneys as well, as I've already mentioned. And it's just also worth bearing in mind that when he's talking about these kind of quiet, undisturbed areas and harborage and so on, it doesn't necessarily just apply to interiors of buildings, to historic properties, to museums. If you have classic vehicles stored in your garage, for example, some of these may have wool carpets or other really tasty upholstery. And that in itself can also be a place of harborage, because you might find, for example, moths living in those carpets and taking up residence within your classic vehicle. That image was actually from the workshops at the Lincolnshire Road Transport Museum, where obviously they're very much actively working on that car. So there was no issue with moths in that car that I'm aware of. But it's something to be alert for anyone who perhaps does either own or work with somewhere that has that kind of thing in their collection. So we've been able to do something about the harborage. We've been able to think about the building maintenance. And so that brings me on to thinking about the food source. And they interlink in some places. Obviously, I've mentioned the mold, for example. But dust is a great food source. You need to try and think about how you can remove all of these potential food sources as far as possible. So things like if someone's if you are working somewhere where there's a cafe, then do think about keeping that nice and clean, keeping the storage areas clean, and keeping, as it says on there, the chimneys and attic spaces clean, because that removes a certain amount of food sources. As I said, you can't remove all of the food sources, but you can help to reduce that. And if you have a particularly high risk area, maybe you can consider whether perhaps you may have a rule where there's no food in that space, for example. Cafes can be a risk area, but as long as you have really well sealed food storage, good food hygiene, cleaning, then that's certainly something that can be managed within a collection area. So to sum up then what we've looked at in the preventive actions, if we carry out the housekeeping, so regular cleaning and building maintenance, we can reduce the food source for pests. Regular housekeeping and cleaning and building maintenance will also reduce the options around harborage, and keeping on top of building maintenance can help to reduce the level of damp within the building. And so overall, when those come together, our aim for all of this is that maybe, hopefully, we will end up with fewer pests and reduce the likelihood that pest infestations might take place. As I said earlier, there are things that you can do, but you're not going to be able to perhaps solve absolutely every problem. And that really brings me on into the next section, thinking about what happens if you do find that you have pests, whether that's in your home or a place that you work. So we'll be talking about what you can do and how far you can go as an individual, and at what point you might need to call in some external advice and help with the situation should pests be around. So again, we're going to be thinking about a range of different options. And it is worth just making the point at this stage that actually these control measures that I'm talking about, they're really very varied, and there isn't a one single answer, because it very much depends on what type of pests there are, where they are. So how big a problem is it? Is it just one object? Is it a whole room? Is it a whole building? What objects are affected? So are they historic items, or are they say perhaps more modern items? What condition are they in? So if they're very fragile versus if they are quite robust. And there's also a certain amount of context around that. You know, what level of expertise do you have in this? What do you feel comfortable with doing? What resources do you have access to? And what budget do you have to tackle it? So all of those coming together can help you to make decisions around what can be done and how to start addressing it. But most of these control measures that I'm going to be talking about actually address these kind of survival conditions that I was talking about. So these things that insects need to thrive, and the things that make them feel comfortable and confident in that area. But sometimes you'll be in a scenario where you think there might be pests. You might have seen something. Maybe you've noticed that an object perhaps has a hole in that you've not seen before, or something like that. If you know that you have pests and you know that there's an infestation, then you would deal with it perhaps differently. But if you aren't sure, then this idea of quarantine can be quite helpful, because what we're always trying to do in conservation is to minimize the amount of treatments that we do directly on objects. So by quarantining things, it gives you the chance to make a decision to see if pests really are present. And the sorts of things that people might do in a museum, particularly a larger museum, is that they might have a room which is designated as a quarantine room, and objects that come into the building through loans or new items that have just been acquired, they go into quarantine and they stay there for, depending on the time of year, certainly at least a couple of weeks, to see whether any pests appear. And that room is sealed, it's protected from the rest of the museum, so that any pests that do emerge in there then don't go out. They just stay in that room and they can be dealt with there. That's a really quite effective process, but I'm very well aware that not everyone has the space to be able to do something like that. So what you might be looking at is doing something on a slightly smaller scale. So one thing that you can take from this is just to obviously be aware of things that are coming to you from outside, and you can use a similar process. So you can wrap the objects up. If you have a polythene bag, something kind of fairly robust see-through plastic, which you tape up so it's completely sealed, you can seal the object within that, and then you can look and see whether new insects appear over time. So the insects that come out of that object will stay within the bag. If you do it as a double bag, that really helps, because it means that there's no chance that the insects will make their way out and go anywhere else. So this is the kind of thing that you'd be looking to do at home, to think about wrapping up any objects that are of concern, and then give it at least a couple of weeks and look for any signs of insects in the bag. So you might see live adult insects, but you may well also see, perhaps more likely will be some dead adult insects, if it is the case that there are insects actively emerging from that object. And if there really isn't any insects, then it may well be that that pest infestation isn't active. that's not uncommon, particularly on older items, that it will have had pests in the past. It will have signs of pest damage, but there are no live insects in it at the moment. Now, the other issue, of course, is it's all very well me suggesting you put something in a bag, but not all items are suitable for that. Maybe it's something that's a part of the building structure and you're not sure if there's new holes appearing. Maybe it's just something that's really quite big. If you can, rather than using a bag, you may be able to wrap some tissue paper around it. In conservation, we prefer to use acid-free tissue because that is a much safer approach for items. So what I mean by that is acids can damage some objects. So if you have tissue that is acid-free, then it shouldn't cause any damage to the object. A conservator might paste that tissue on using a specialist adhesive, depending on what the item is and whether or not that's suitable. I certainly wouldn't recommend you try doing something like that at home, but it may be possible that you could perhaps tape the tissue, not putting tape on the object itself, but perhaps putting the tissue around and putting a bit of tape on the tissue just to try and see whether or not that shows anything. So the kind of thing that you're looking for would be whether new holes appear from insects coming out of that object and then having to eat their way out through the tissue. So you would start to see insect holes appearing in the tissue. There are obviously disadvantages to that approach. If an object is in a bag and the insects stay in the bag, they're then not going anywhere else. If you're using this kind of tissue and looking for new holes, it means the adults have emerged and they may well have laid some more eggs somewhere else. So it does have a potential downside that you are not collecting up the insects at that point. The other thing to look out for is any evidence of whether the damage is fresh. If there are holes, for example, then you're looking at things like the insect frass, this poo that we talked about last week. Particularly if we're talking about wood, then older wood damage tends to be a bit more discoloured, whereas fresh damage tends to look quite pale coloured and generally newer than the older damage. So there are a few different things that you can do if you think you might have pests, but you're just not quite sure yet before you move on to some of the more active options around treatments. So I'm just rerunning the slide that I had a little bit earlier to give you a reminder of these conditions that insects need to thrive. Because what I'm going to be talking about next is I'm going to run through how we can alter or adjust some of these conditions to try and help us to deal with a pest infestation. So it gives us a way of thinking about how we can address some of these issues around insects and what we can do about that. So in terms of the housekeeping and building maintenance, if we know that we have insects, then again, we can still make use of our housekeeping, our cleaning and maintaining the building to try and make the insects go away, so that it stops being a nice place where they want to live. If you have an insect that particularly likes damp, if it isn't damp anymore, they might go. If they're an insect that eats dust, then making sure that it's very clean might help, but that's certainly a bit more challenging to deal with the food aspect. But you could also address it through making sure that wherever those pests are living, if it is dark and undisturbed generally, that you make sure that it's actively not dark and undisturbed. So causing a disturbance through cleaning can be one approach. And the example I've got on there is that potentially if you have moths living on a carpet, say it's under a bed or under a sofa, if that area is regularly vacuumed, then the moths will eventually go away. They some of them will be hoovered up. They won't enjoy living there anymore. The caveat that I've got for that, of course, is that if it's a historic carpet, you shouldn't automatically assume that it is safe to vacuum. Certainly not in the sense of kind of getting a normal vacuum out and going over the surface. There may be much more careful techniques that you need to use. So do talk to a conservator if you find anything like that on a historic surface. But if, say, we're talking about a modern carpet in a storage area or something like that, then if you start vacuuming that area, then it's quite likely that that won't be a popular place for the moths to stay anymore. Now, one fairly common treatment that we tend to come across is actually thinking about how we change the temperature. So I've said that pests like it to be relatively warm in order for them to reproduce. But if they get very, very cold, then the pests won't survive. So that certainly kind of addresses that sort of survival aspect of it. Now, if you have a deep freeze that goes down to about -30, and it has a quick freeze button, you can get things very cold very quickly. If you just have a sort of standard domestic freezer, they usually go down to about -18. That ideally you want a quick freeze with that as well. The problem with freezing is that if the freezing happens too slowly, insects can still become dormant. They will basically, almost like they're hibernating, so they'll kind of go to sleep, and then when it warms up again, they'll just wake up. So you have to be quite cautious to make sure that if you can get the temperature down quite low, like the -30, and quickly, then it tends to be much more successful than a slow freeze to a lower or less effective temperature like the -18. And that's why I've suggested on there, normally if it's going to -30, you might only need 3 days worth of freezing. But if you're going down to -18, you really want to leave that object in the freezer for a couple of weeks. If we think about how we do that, then you need to put the item into a bag, but actually you use that kind of polythene bag. That's what we usually use, and then you seal it up, but you do it as a double bag. And the reason that we do that is it stops problems with condensation forming on the objects as the temperature changes. Because of the risk of some insects becoming dormant, to be really sure of effectiveness, then you might need to freeze that item twice. So you freeze it once, you give it a little bit of time for any remaining eggs to hatch out, and then you freeze it again, just to make sure that you've really caught everything that's in there. Again, if you do 2 freezings, you still need to make sure that it's double bagged both times. What is really, really important, though, is before you consider doing something like that, is to please run that past a conservator, because some historic items can be damaged by freezing. So you shouldn't just assume that it's okay to put that item in the freezer. Obviously, if it's a modern item, a domestic item that you feel is very robust, and it's something that you aren't at all concerned about in terms of its preservation longer term, then by all means go ahead. But please do talk to a conservator if you have any historic items and you're thinking that freezing might be the way to go with them. It is also possible to work with high temperatures. There are some specialist treatments where they will heat not just an object, but indeed they can treat an entire building by raising the temperature to, in this case, 52 to sometimes up to 60 degrees. And pests have a certain temperature tolerance zone, and so once the temperature goes above that, then those pests will not be able to survive. It is really important to control the humidity during that process, because when things get hot, they can dry out, they can start to crack, and that's really, really bad for objects, but also potentially for building structures as well. There is also the issue that higher temperatures causes things to decay faster. They start to break down at a faster rate as the temperature goes up. So it's not something that anyone can do at home. This is very much a very specialist process that you would need to call someone in for. But if you do need to treat a much larger area, this is certainly one option that could be considered. And I will just also come back to the bats that I mentioned before. It's definite. If it goes up to 52 degrees, it will kill anything in that building, even if it isn't a pest. And so you must absolutely not consider doing something like that should you have any bats or other species in the building that you don't want any kind of impact on. So our other one to think about is this idea of reproduction. Now, it's worth me explaining at this point that pest control methods have a specific licensing process that they need to go through before they can be sold or advertised as pest control. Pheromone traps that I talked about last week as part of the trapping, if you're using those pheromone traps, they will attract males of a particular species, and that can reduce the potential breeding population. But it is important to say that these kind of traps are not licensed as a pest control method. The licensing is quite costly, so there are a lot of people who aren't willing to go or able to go through that kind of expense to put that through. So although pheromone traps aren't officially licensed, they can help to remove some of the males from the population. A relatively recent approach is to bring in something called Exosex. So this is a brand name, and it's a male confusion trap, and it's designed for clothes moth. So it doesn't actually hold insects in the trap. What happens is that there is a synthetic female pheromone which attracts the males to the trap. Those males are then coated with this pheromone dust, and then they leave the trap. So like I said, they're not held by a trap in this case. They're just coated with pheromone, and then they fly off and go back into the general population of moths. So there are two ways in which this interferes with the reproductive cycle of the moths. First of all, the males that are coated with that female pheromone can't tell where the females are, because they've been really well coated with female pheromones themselves. So they can't actually figure out where the female is because they're just overwhelmed with all this female pheromone around them. It also confuses other males who haven't been in the trap, but those other males think that that male coated in female pheromone must be a female. And the encounter between those two males means that some pheromone dust is then transferred onto the other male. So it spreads powder further around, and that male is then blocked from reproducing as well. So it carries on throughout the population. So if we have a think about oxygen then, and how the oxygen part of things works, then what we'll see is that oxygen might sound like a bit of a challenging one. I mean, it's all around us. We all need this to breathe, and pests need it as well. If we take out the oxygen, then the pests don't survive. So one thing that we can think about is actually on a small scale. If you have a small object that has pests present, you can seal that object into a bag with something called an oxygen scavenger. So these are things that you can buy. They're often sort of tablet based or small sachets, and as long as it's a sealed bag, it will suck the oxygen out of the air within that bag. And so it takes those oxygen levels right down. You can also buy sort of accompanying things that change colour to show you whether or not all the oxygen has actually been removed, if it's all been successful. Now, one thing to bear in mind, of course, is that, again, this is something that you would need to talk about with a conservator if you had anything historic, because some items can be damaged by this anoxic environment. So, for example, sometimes pigments will change colour, so paints might change colour because there's no oxygen in the air. Again, it's not something that you would necessarily want to do at home, but I think it's something that's quite useful for you to know about. The other thing to bear in mind is that some pests, again, can become dormant. And so dormant pests really don't need a lot of oxygen. And again, that might mean that this kind of treatment could miss some pests that are in that dormant phase. Or alternatively, if you have an object where the insects are quite deep within it, maybe it's quite thick or something like that, then the oxygen might not be fully removed from these very kind of deep crevices of that item. And it might mean that those objects need more than one treatment in that case. So again, just something to consider, that it's not always sort of fully effective. So on a larger scale, before just finishing off talking about oxygen, on a larger scale, it is possible to get specialist companies in again who will introduce anoxia to a larger environment. So they will introduce a gas like nitrogen to replace the oxygen in the air in an area. So again, you can do a slightly larger building-based treatment using that. So this is a reminder of the kind of things that we're looking at before, but I've added in some of these treatments. So we can look at removing the oxygen through anoxia. We can look at removing some of the food, perhaps through cleaning. We can look at adjusting the temperature through freezing or heating. We can make it a less pleasant place for them to live by looking at our cleaning and building maintenance. And we can address the reproduction by using specialized pheromone methods to try and make sure that the insects don't encounter the females. So it reduces the levels of the population over time. And we can also address things like the relative humidity, potentially through building maintenance. So these are lots of things that we can think about doing, but one thing that I haven't really touched on yet is chemical treatments. And the reason that that comes up last on my sort of list of options is that I tend to feel that this is very much a last resort, particularly around historic objects or historic buildings. Because if you're using chemical treatments, it may be that your pest infestation is very severe and you need a very rapid response. Or it may be that the other options are not suitable for whatever reason. So that's the bit that I'm going to come on to next. But I'm going to pause here now to see if anyone has any questions about what we've covered so far. So if you have anything that you want to ask, maybe if you'd like to type into the chat, or you can raise your hand if you prefer. Okay, well, it's quiet at the moment. So I did say that we would have a short break when we got part way through, and I think now is probably a good time for us to take a short break, stretch your legs, go and get a drink. And my computer clock, a suitable time scale for quarantine. Thank you, Sylvia. So I would suggest that it does depend on things like the temperature. So in the summer period, then you would certainly see insects appearing within a 2-week time period. If it's winter and it's in an unheated space or it doesn't have very much heating, then you might not see any pests emerging at all. So it does need to be warm enough for that to happen. But if we assume that it's in a kind of standard heated room and that in the winter you have central heating or some other heating system that keeps it sort of maybe around the kind of 18-ish, 18-20 degrees, sort of a comfortable indoor temperature. And then obviously in the summer you've got the temperatures there, then usually 2 weeks will be enough for you to see something happening. You should see a few insects emerging. If you are worried, if you're uncertain, if you think it may be a bit on the cool side, then I'd be tempted to push that out to a month, just to make really sure. But you know, warm summertime, 2 weeks should cover it. Thank you. Okay, so does anyone have anything else that they want to talk about? Okay, in that case, we'll have our short break, and I'm going to suggest that we return at 7:35. So that gives us just over 5 minutes for a short break, and I'll see you all very soon. Thank you. Hello again. Hopefully everyone is just about back now after having had your short break. And just to follow on then from what I've been talking about, we've covered a range of different treatments or potential treatments that you could consider. But now what we're going to move on to is having a look at just a very brief look at the kind of chemical treatment that you might use if you absolutely have to. So generally, the kind of insecticide that gets used is something that's often called a residual insecticide. So this kind of insecticide is something that leaves a residue on the surface. And it leaves a certain amount of chemical behind so that it keeps acting over a longer time period. Now, there are obviously certain risks to that. You're introducing a chemical into an object, onto a surface that leaves a residue behind. And something like permethrin, which is the example that I've got there, which is a relatively common insecticide, then there can have some health and safety implications. It can cause skin irritation, but longer term exposure or high levels of exposure can lead to more serious health and safety issues such as feeling sick, headaches, shortness of breath, even seizures. So it is important that you are, if you're making the choice to use some kind of insecticide, that you are aware of the potential risks, not just to the objects, but also to the risk to you as the person who's using that. And that kind of comes back to the basis for IPM in the first place, that actually one of the main principles for IPM, integrated pest management, is moving away from this use of chemical treatments as much as possible. But it is still important to acknowledge that there are occasions when chemical treatments are needed. And it is important that when you're using that kind of chemical treatment, that you're aware of how to handle those in a safe way. So please always make sure that you have a good look through any kind of manufacturer's instructions or information around health and safety and any precautions that you need to take around these kind of insecticides. Now, if you're working with historic objects, then it is also important to consider the potential risks to the object. So there are a couple of different ways where you might add an insecticide, if you like, to an object. One option can be injecting it. So, for example, if there are multiple holes in an object, then you could inject an insecticide into it. Or alternatively, you could use a surface spray treatment. Now, either of those options actually can lead to staining. The spray, obviously being surface only, covers the whole object, but it might miss larvae that are perhaps deep within the wood. And being a residual insecticide, it will kill them when they emerge as adults, hopefully, but it won't. They'll already have done that damage as to being in the larval stage. So it's again, it's something that's worth bearing in mind, that there are some potential risks around that use of an insecticide on individual objects. If you have a large pest problem, then it can be worth considering whether something called fumigation, so basically someone coming around and spraying high levels of insecticide throughout an entire building, or say an intensive treatment throughout a room, for example. And that is something that could be considered if the pest problem is very widespread. But again, there are potential risks about knowing what objects, what items are in the room and whether or not that's going to be safe. And it is also something that is best done by a specialist company, because you do need to take quite extensive health and safety precautions because of the level of exposure to insecticide from the person doing that fumigation treatment. It is not safe for a member of the public to consider trying to do that themselves. There are far too many risks involved. So just to sum up then, like I said, there are chemical options, but they're not always necessary if you can use some of the other measures. But there may be times when you do need to make that choice and that decision that insecticides are a necessary part of how you approach things. In conservation and more generally, there's quite a lot of research going on in pest control, because pest control isn't just an issue within buildings, it's also a very active issue in things like agriculture in particular. People don't want pests that eat our food crops. And so some solutions that are created for agriculture can sometimes be transferred into conservation, or sometimes the conservation research might find something that helps with the agricultural side. So it's very much an approach that actually benefits from all of these different strands and these different ways that people are looking at it. And there's quite often regular conferences looking at things like pest control and how people have applied it in different areas. And one area that has come up recently, which I put up in case you saw this on the news, was about wasps being used to control moths at Blickling Hall, which is one of the National Trust properties in Norfolk. And that was published back in February, so not very long ago. And these wasps are really tiny, barely visible. They're no threat to people. They're not going to sting you. But what they do is they lay eggs in moth eggs, but rather than a moth hatching out of that egg, instead a wasp hatches out. It's something that is potentially quite a relatively slow process, because obviously you're tackling the eggs, but you don't know how many eggs are going to be, or the wasps are going to be effective at getting for each breeding cycle. So it's not going to be an immediate answer, but they're using these wasps alongside the male confusion traps. And because this is such a new area of research, actually, I don't know how they're getting on. They're going to be sharing the results of that at a conference later in the year. I think it's in September. And so we'll find out what happens there. But it's certainly worth me saying that there are new things and new ideas coming out all the time. And things do change and they do move forwards in the field quite regularly. Well, this last kind of section that I really wanted to do is to try and draw together what I've been talking about so far, and thinking about how we pull all these different strands that I've been talking about over these 2 weeks and sort of view them more holistically, because all of these things that I've covered all form part of a successful IPM program. So I do just want to kind of try and help you think about how that works. Now, one of the things that you need to think about if you are trying to establish integrated pest management for the first time, there does need a certain amount of time, although it tends to be a little bit heavier at the start in terms of making sure that you've got the training, you've figured out how you're going to document pests in the long term, where you're going to put traps, and then once you get into a routine of checking those traps every 3 months, then as long as you don't have a vast number of traps, the kind of time commitment on an ongoing basis isn't necessarily massively high. There is a certain amount of cost involved if you're going to buy pest traps, But overall, these measures are designed to actually reduce the potential damage to objects, to buildings. That means that people in the long term should be able to save a certain amount of time, because they're not spending time dealing with pest infestations, or not as much time. And they're not spending as much money dealing with the actual pest infestation themselves, because you've been able to do as much as you can to prevent it or reduce it at an earlier stage. It could be that the trapping picks up a problem much sooner than if the traps weren't there. Now, this means that it's really important that everyone who's in that building knows that they have a role to play, even if it's just keeping an eye open for anything that's a bit odd on windowsills, and then knowing who to talk to. Even something small like that is actually a really valuable thing for people to understand and to appreciate from something like this. I've obviously flagged up a range of different points where you might want to talk to a conservator about advice in terms of the objects and what's safe to do should you have historic objects that you're working with, say if you found a pest infestation generally. But conservators, as part of their remit, might be able to help with advice about actually establishing this IPM program, if that's something that you're interested in doing. They may well be able to, they should be able to give you advice on where you might want to think about putting traps and what traps might be suitable. A conservator can help with, if you're working in an organisation, they can help with writing policies, help you with thinking about how to do that documentation and recording, and delivering training to a range of different people, so staff and volunteers, so that they can start to understand their role in IPM and how they can get involved. More broadly, conservators can help with things like advice around how to control the internal environment. So sometimes there might be small changes that could be made to sort of internal heating systems to try and get better control over, say, damp, high relative humidity, for example. And that can be something that might help to discourage pests. Conservators can also give advice on the basic housekeeping tasks, so the sorts of things that it's safe for people to do at, sort of in a museum or in a historic house setting, with perhaps some historic objects. So they can provide training and saying it's okay to clean this in this way, but there may be some things where the conservator might say, this should always be cleaned by a specialist. So they can, again, they can assess the object and give you some advice on what can be done and what can't be done. And finally, also conservators can carry out hands-on interventive object treatment. So if you do have something that's been damaged, then a conservator may be able to carry out some repairs to help perhaps stabilize that object, or to reduce the visual impact of that damage. So it's quite a broad remit, and different conservators have different specialisms, and I'll be giving you a link at the end so that if you do need to find a conservator, you have an idea of where you might be able to look. Now, this slide actually brings us back to something that I showed you near the start of last week's session. What I've aimed to do over these two talks is to really kind of draw together this whole combination of the different elements that actually form part of an overall IPM program. So thinking about the identification of pests, so being familiar with the sorts of pests that you have in your own building, and also thinking about this kind of identification, having the chance to have a look at some of the images of them that I've shared. We have the treatment aspect, which I've covered just now, thinking about ways in which you can prevent pests, or if you do have pests, thinking about ways that you might be able to deal with that if it does occur. And generally thinking about the overall monitoring, so keeping an eye on what happens around the building, thinking about trapping insects, and introducing a quarantine program if that's something that's possible for you to do in your situation, or even just a sort of temporary check of objects if needs be. And it's really important to just re-emphasize this ongoing evaluation aspect, that at all points you're always asking yourself questions, is this working? If you do find pests and you deal with a pest outbreak, why did that happen? Is there anything that could be done or could be changed to try and prevent that happening in the future, or to at least perhaps reduce the impact of that if it maybe wasn't picked up as early as it could have been? So there's lots of ways in which you can think about that, but also I mentioned last week sort of evaluating where the traps are. Are these traps in the best place? Are they doing what you want them to do? Do you need to change anything around that? But also evaluation of things like, how is the building maintenance planned? How is the housekeeping planned? Is it working? Are there things that perhaps need to be looked at, things that need to be changed, or even things that maybe need maintenance but don't have the budget? How are you going to work towards raising funds to be able to do that? Because obviously there are potentially long-term consequences if you can't kind of keep on top of these sort of smaller maintenance tasks. They can become quite big maintenance tasks. And in terms of this kind of training, if you're in an organisation where you do have a range of different staff and volunteers, then those staff and volunteers are not always static. There will be new people coming in, there may be people leaving, and you just need to make sure that the training program is something that's ongoing. It's not something that you talk to people about it once and they will remember it forever. Actually, it is something that you need to revisit regularly, just to make sure that new people are introduced into what you're doing and what you're trying to do, but also just to make sure that actually other people get a bit of a refresher. Because if they've had a look at some examples of pests 2 years ago, they might well have forgotten what a carpet beetle looks like if they haven't seen one since. So they're not necessarily going to know whether or not to worry should they see something on a windowsill, for example. Again, it's just making sure that everyone's really kind of up to date and understanding what's going on. Now, that was the kind of main content that I wanted to present to you for today's session. So what I'd like to do now is to actually try and get you to have a think about how you might do this yourself. So I've got a couple of scenarios that I'm going to present to you. And I'm going to ask you for some thoughts and ideas about what you're going to do. But before I move on to those, can I just ask now whether anyone has any questions before we move on to this point? Again, if you want to type anything in the chat, then that would be brilliant. Can pests survive in the Hoover? I think it probably depends on the pest and the type of vacuum that you have, but I would certainly suggest that if you've got a Hoover with a bag, that you empty it straight away, or if you've got one of those kind of vacuum types, again, just sort of the kind of clear ones where they whirl around. Yeah, I would certainly empty it straight away outside, just to make sure that any pests that have survived the hoovering process are definitely not able to climb out, because I mean the level of food that is in a hoover bag would be perfect for an awful lot of pests. The suction process and the filters may well mean that a number of pests wouldn't survive, but I would say there's still a chance that something could live through it. So best to make sure that your hoover is empty straight after using it. Cool, thanks. Has anyone else got anything that they would like to ask about? It's a difficult one. There is anecdotal evidence that the kind of essential oils and the sachets have some beneficial impact, and there has been some studies in essential oils more on an agricultural basis that suggests that certain essential oils do help to certainly to discourage pests. I'm not sure if they would actually kill them, but certainly there is evidence from agriculture that certain essential oils do discourage pests from being in a particular area. I think if you want to actually kill the pests, the studies that I've seen around essential oils involve actually spraying the pests with that oil. So for example, you sort of have a crop and you spray it with that particular essential oil. There's been a lot less research, as far as I'm aware, in terms of how that might work in a home. I can't say to you, yes, they will work. But if you do have a problem and you want to put something like that in your home, at least it smells nice and it might help. And the only thing to be cautious of, obviously, is if it's a historic item that it might come into contact with. You have to be quite careful about introducing any sort of additional things externally, but certainly if it's just something you're going to use in a domestic home, then it's worth a try. I'm sorry I can't give you an absolute definitive answer on it, but is there anyone else that would like to ask me anything? Okay, so I'll show you the first exercise. So I thought this one would be quite fun, and I think it's kind of realistic, I guess, the sort of thing that might happen. Though I don't know whether you also occasionally find that you're on an internet auction site and you order something, but let's just pretend that you've done that and you ordered a nice little wooden box. But when you look at the box, you turn it over and realise that there are some holes in the base that you think look a little bit like they could be pest damage. So what do you think might cause holes in wooden objects before we go any further? Can anyone suggest anything that might make a hole in something wooden? So if you want to type something into the chat, if you have any thoughts of where the holes might have come from. Thank you, Claire. Yeah, that would be kind of one of the first thoughts. Yeah, absolutely. Woodworm, thanks, Duncan, which obviously grows up into the adult version being a furniture beetle. So that would seem like the most likely option. So it's got some holes in the base. It might be pest damage, and I know you can obviously send the box back and say that, well, it wasn't as described, but actually you really like the box and you want to keep it. So what do you think you might do? What are your options around this? And there's more than one answer, so just have a think about what we've been talking about, and pop something in the chat when you have a suggestion. Fantastic, thank you. Yep, we've got some great options going on there. So I think we've got some ideas of quarantine coming out there, which is, yep, that definitely makes sense. It's nice and small. As you can see there, it's only about 8 centimeters, so you could easily pop that into a bag, double bag, and have a look in quarantine just to make sure that nothing appears. And I think I would certainly agree with you that you could have the option of, if something is alive, then I quite agree, you could potentially look at freezing it, or you could look at the anoxia treatment. So you could use a bag with an oxygen scavenger, an oxygen remover, to then treat it afterwards if you needed to. So fantastic, well done, that's really good. Okay, so our next scenario then, so let's see, you've done a routine check of your pest traps, you know, the ones that you look at every 3 months. It's this pest trap in particular has 22 case-bearing clothes moth in it, and it's in a historic property. It's within the storage area, and it's a storage area with some mixed materials. It's got some textiles in, it's got some taxidermy, and there's some ceramics in there. So first of all, in the chat, are you worried about the clothes moth? Do you think this is something that we should be concerned about, or is that okay? Thank you. Yeah, I think it's fair to be a bit concerned. We've got some vulnerable materials there. Yeah, as Claire's mentioned, especially when you've got textiles and taxidermy around. The ceramics will be all right, but the other bits are a bit of a worry. And also, you know, given that it's a case, we're working through it as some examples. If you weren't worried, then we wouldn't be going any further. So it gives us something to talk about, which means that yes, we will definitely be concerned. So again, this is one where there's kind of multiple possible answers, but let's just say, so we found these clothes moth in a pest trap. What do you think would be one of the first things that you might do as kind of next steps? So again, if you want to type something into the chat, so take a moment to have a think about it, and then think, what might you do if you found these moths in a trap? What would be your next step? I'll give you a hint. if you've got some moths in a trap, where do you think they might be coming from? And where do you think the moths could be? Great, thanks. Yeah, I would certainly suggest that quarantine is a potential option, but we might need to just have this kind of one step before that, which is having a look around and just see, we have some items here that can be food for pests. So where are these moths living? Because they're not just all coming in from outside and heading straight for the trap. That suggests that there probably is some kind of infestation somewhere. So you need to have a look through the whole collection and just see if you can figure out where they are and if any objects are potentially being damaged. And I absolutely agree that cleaning round certainly makes sense, because as we've talked about this kind of dark and undisturbed areas, then you might want to sort of make sure that everything's really nice and clean, that it reduces the amount of things that they can eat in there. Okay, you've had a look around, and it's a case-bearing clothes moth, which is why you find some cases. Those are the kind of larval stage, and some moths, and they're very happy living within a rolled up historic rug. It's a really big rug. So what sort of things might you do next if you found this big historic rug, which is this home to lots of moths? Fantastic. Yeah, so you certainly want to think about getting that rug with the moths away from the other objects that are potentially quite vulnerable. If you've got somewhere where you can put it, then that can be helpful. But even if you can't physically take it out of there, at least if you can get it wrapped up, it means that the moths aren't sort of spreading elsewhere. And you probably should check with a conservator, because we're talking about a historic item, so you do want to just sort of run that past the conservator. But it's likely that you might well be able to look at vacuuming that rug. You might be able to look at freezing it, depending on whether or not you've got the big enough freezer. And you would need to be able to find a space where you could work on it, where the moths wouldn't impact on other items. So you'd certainly need to think about a location in which you could do that kind of treatment, because you'd obviously need to unroll the rug. And what you don't want to do is unroll the rug, have all the moths fly out of it, and then hop onto some other nearby object that is also kind of tasty for them. So there's quite a lot to think about in that kind of context as to the logistics of dealing with something on a much larger scale, and also where it is potentially fragile, and you have to think about the sort of vulnerabilities around that, and also the wider collection. The other thing I'd certainly suggest doing in that area is to just to make sure that there isn't any moths anywhere else as well that might already have jumped out and gone somewhere. So you do have to make sure that you do have a good check around everything, and address all of the objects if needs be, if they've all got issues. Very good. Thank you very much. I was really good of you to all take part and to have a think about those issues, and it's really nice to see that you've certainly really kind of taken on board everything that we've been talking about today and last week. Now, there's one final activity that I would like you to do, and I've called it action points. So what I'm going to suggest, you can vary it a little bit if you want, is just to make notes of 3 things that you would like to do that might help you to manage pests that maybe might come into your home, or perhaps somewhere where you work, or somewhere where you volunteer, or you're involved with in some other way, some other organisation. So you don't have to post those in the chat, although you're very welcome to if you want. But if you want to just do that on pen and paper yourselves, then that's absolutely fine too. I'm going to just go quiet for a couple of minutes to let you have a think about those and the sorts of things that you might, these kind of take-home points that might be able to apply to the kind of things that you do. So it's just showing as 12 minutes past now. So I'm going to give you until 14 minutes past just to have a think about those 3 things. And if you get a bit carried away and go for 4, go ahead. That's fine. Okay, it's now 14 minutes past, so I hope you've had a chance to have a think about it, and that you have some useful things that you'll be able to take away from the session, and that will hopefully help you moving forwards in caring for your properties, your homes, and any other museums, galleries, wherever you are based. I promised you that I would put up a link showing some additional resources. In particular, if you don't know where to find a conservator, then a good place to start is with the Conservation Register, and you can input all sorts of different information, like the type of material, the types of objects that you are looking for, or whether you want someone who specialises in something like preventive conservation. Integrated pest management comes under preventive conservation, or whether you want to sort of find someone who works on, you know, a range of different types of artifacts, documentation. You can use the Conservation Register to find someone who is an accredited conservator. And conservators may choose to apply for accreditation. It's generally 5 years after they've graduated from their conservation training course, and that accreditation is an external assessment of that person's conservation work. So only people who have done that accreditation process, or companies who employ at least one accredited conservator will be on that list. The other resource that might be helpful is actually museums development networks. So for those of you who are working in a historic house or museum organisation, there are a range of different museums development networks in different areas of the country. And if you aren't already associated with those or a member, they can help provide funding and advice for anyone who's either working towards becoming an accredited museum or organisations that are already accredited museums. And they can provide additional training and support in a range of different areas and different ways. And again, that can include the pests aspect of that, amongst lots of other things. Okay, that's everything from me. Does anyone else have any questions or anything else that they'd like me to talk about? Okay, in that case, that's the end of my second talk. Thank you all so very much for coming. And I'd just like to obviously just kind of finish by also acknowledging the organisations who've sponsored these talks. So it's been funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and it's delivered for the Wisbech High Street project. So thank you very much for them for inviting me along to come and talk to you all. It's been really lovely to meet you. Good luck with your pests, and if you do have any questions or queries, then please do feel free to drop me an email, and I will post my email address in the chat for you. So if you do want to get in touch, then I'd be very happy to have a chat to you about any queries that you have. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks
Bye.
so much for that, Linda.
Thank you.